Okay, so today we're going to talk about logical fallacies, and I really enjoy logical fallacies. That's one of my favorite things to teach. I think they're really interesting and they're really useful in your life. You'll see them all over the place when you're watching political campaigns or political messages or when you watch advertising. And it's good to be aware of them so that you can be smart about arguments people make to you and about the arguments that you make. A logical fallacy is basically a trick or an error in reasoning. And you can think of it as a basis of argument as if you're sticking to the argument, if you are using evidence and examples to develop your ideas, then you have a real argument. If you don't have those things, you have a problem, you have a logical fallacy. I say trick because often people commit fallacies on purpose in order to manipulate or deceive you. So you need to be aware of this when people are trying to convince you of something. And I say error because often we commit fallacies without being aware of them ourselves. And if we want to have a good logical argument, have a good appeal to logos, we need to avoid fallacies. And there are thousands of different name fallacies, and I'll mention a few of the names today, but you don't have to know all the names as long as you know the four most common types of fallacies, and then you can identify a fallacy even if you don't know what its name is. One common type is providing reasoning that requires incorrect assumptions. So in order to believe an argument, the reader must accept assumptions that are wrong. You'll remember when we were talking about the elements of an argument has claim and reasons and evidence, but every argument has an assumption, and they're really based on those assumptions. So if you have a wrong assumption, you don't have a good argument. One of the most common types of fallacies is where you don't address an argument at all. Instead, you try to distract your audience. So distracting by making information seem relevant to the claim when it isn't, leading the reader or listener off the track. And this, again, you'll see frequently if you ever watch political debates and a politician gets asked a question he or she doesn't want to answer, they will try to answer a different question or go on to a different subject. Very, very, very common. Third type is providing support for a claim that depends on the claim already being true or simply restating the claim. So it's called circular reasoning. I see this a lot actually in student papers where they'll make a claim and then to support their claim, they'll just restate the claim in a new way. So that's actually not providing evidence for your claim, you're just restating it. And it can be very subtle, sometimes it isn't. And then the fourth type is arguments that are based only on emotional appeals without evidence. And emotional appeals are very, very powerful ways to persuade people, but they're not an argument. And often they're just manipulation. So you want to be aware. Pay attention to arguments and say, are they really just playing with my emotions, or are they making an argument in which they give me evidence, right? So without evidence, it's not an argument. Like I said, you don't have to know the names, but one good way to really decide whether something is a fallacy or not is really to go through kind of questioning approach to the argument. So the first thing you have to do is identify the claims and the reasons that the people are making to back their claims. So whatever someone's arguing, what are they claiming? What are their reasons in support of it? And then an easy way to really decide if you have a fallacy or not is think of reasons that might be relevant to the claim and contrast these with the author's reasons. Are the reasons that the author is making actually relevant to their claims? And here's an example. So my claim, you will learn a lot from Professor Jones. The reasons students all say is lectures are entertaining. So if you think about education, entertaining might be relevant, but there are lots of other issues that were probably more relevant, like how educated is Mr. Jones? What approach does he take to teaching? What does he have his students do? And so on. Another thing you can do, determine whether the reason states a specific or concrete advantage or disadvantage to support the claim. So are they actually making solid supporting statements? And if not, the author may be committing a fallacy. A third thing you can think about is, what are the necessary assumptions that I have to believe in order to have the claim support the reason? What would one have to believe for the reason to logically support the claim? If those assumptions seem illogical, then again it might be a fallacy. So identify the necessary assumptions by asking yourself, what would one have to believe for the reason to logically support the claim? And then ask yourself, do those assumptions make sense? For example, the government should just make marijuana legal because they'll never be able to stop everyone from using it. There are lots of assumptions here, but one assumption is that the only way to be beneficial is to completely eliminate it, right? So even if you can't stop everyone from using marijuana, it still might be beneficial to stop most people from using marijuana or many people from using marijuana. So that assumption could be a fallacy. In fact, it is a type of fallacy called a search for a perfect cure. And then look for phrases that strongly appeal to your emotions. And I shouldn't say just phrases because we have a lot of images now too. And images that strongly appeal to your emotions that might distract you from relevant reasons, particularly if evidence is missing from the argument. Alright, so what I'm going to do is show you different fallacy examples, and you could stop if you want to on each one and ask yourself, which of these four types of fallacies is it? Is it an attempt to distract? Is it a faulty assumption? Is it a circular argument? Or is it appealed to only emotions, right? So each of these is an example of each of those, and some of them really, they could be looked at a couple different ways, but I want you to think about what is it most strongly. All right, this is my favorite ex-governor, one of the reasons I'm in Colorado today instead of California, and this was an actual quote from him when he was having an argument with the California legislature about the issue of the state budget, right? And the quote, of course, I won't do my Arnold voice. If they don't have the guts to come up here in front of you and say, I don't want to represent you, I want to represent the special interests, the unions, the trial lawyers, if they don't have the guts, I call them girly men. There's a little bit of Arnold there. If you look at this, what type of fallacy might it be? And this is actually called an ad hominem attack, which means to the man. And the idea is that you're attacking the person rather than the issues. You could think of it as a way to distract, and often it's also an attempt to harm the reputation of the other side, but that's also a distraction. Instead of actually discussing the issues, as I say, you're just attacking the other person. So that's called an ad hominem, which is Latin for to the man. If we allow same-sex marriages, what does stop people from marrying their pets next? So I heard this on the radio once and I thought it was kind of a funny argument. What type of fallacy do you think this is? Alright, this is a faulty assumption, right? And this is called a slippery slope, making the assumption that a proposed step will set off an uncontrollable chain of undesirable events when procedures exist to prevent such a chain of events from happening. Right, so there's an assumption you're just going to go with one step to the worst possible outcome without any impediment in between. And this is a very, very, very common type of argument. I like this one. The Bible says a good Christian should love his neighbor. Mr. Jones loves his neighbor, Mrs. Smith. In fact, whenever Mrs. Jones is away, that's his wife, he goes over to Mrs. Smith's house and spends the night, right? So he's loving his neighbor. So Mr. Jones is a good Christian. What type of fallacy do you think this is? This is an attempt to distract again by equivocation, which just means you use a key word in two different ways, right? So you have two or more meanings in an argument such that the argument fails to make sense once the shifts in meaning are recognized. And this is, again, a very common way to confuse people about an argument, which is another way a way to distract them. Coke is the best soft drink in the world. More people buy it than any other. Alright, what's the fallacy here? Right, this is a faulty assumption again. The assumption that anything large groups of people favor is desirable. And obviously, if you look at history, there are lots of times when large groups of people favored something which was clearly not desirable. For example, in Nazi Germany, a lot of people supported Hitler and the Nazis. Clearly they were wrong. This is an advertisement that came out when McCain and Obama were running against each other. This was a television ad, and it said, Obama's one accomplishment: legislation to teach comprehensive sex education to kindergartners. What type of fallacy do you think this is? if you said appeal to emotion, you're right. But by the way, they actually cut out a lot here. So the law Obama voted for was age-appropriate sex education. And the education for kindergartners is supposed to teach them about good and bad touching, protect children from child predators. So what you end up with, it's called a straw person, but it's really a distortion of the opponent's view so that it's easy to attack, thus attacking a point of view that doesn't really exist. But this is an appeal to emotions, right? Because if you're a parent, you may not want your kindergartners to learn about sex. And I think to a lot of parents that'd be very frightening. And this happens a lot, obviously, in politics. Many of their appeals are appeals to emotion. You're either with us or against us. What's the fallacy? This is again a faulty assumption, right? Assuming there are only two alternatives which exist when it's possible that there are more than two. In fact, I'd say it's likely in almost every situation that there are more than two alternatives. Government is like business. Just as business must be sensitive primarily to the bottom line, so also must government. And this is a false or faulty analogy. An analogy is when you make a comparison between two things in order to make a point. But a faulty analogy is when you assume that two things that appear alike are the same, so it's a faulty assumption again, right? Although two things may be superficially similar, they may have much more significant differences. So, for example, businesses, of course they're concerned about the bottom line, which means money, because their job is to make money. But a government's primary job is not to make money, so obviously the bottom line is not the most important thing in a government. Although it's true that if you go incredibly into debt, it can make the government unfunctional. So you think doctor-assisted suicide is morally acceptable. You probably also think that the death penalty is a great idea. And this is called a red herring. It's an attempt to distract or divert your attention from the original topic. All right, here's Barack Obama. He says, "The challenges we face are real, they are serious, there are many, they will not be met easily or in a short span of time, but know this, America, they will be met. On this day we gather because we have chosen hope over fear, unity of purpose over conflict and discord. On this day we come to proclaim an end to the petty grievances and false promises, the recriminations and worn-out dogmas that for too long have strangled our politics." Right? So this again is an appeal to emotion without any substance behind it. Of course, this can also be done for rhetorical effect to make your speech more interesting. But if you're trying to convince somebody and all you've got is emotionally appealing words without any evidence to support them, it is a fallacy. And this is called a glittering generality. And you'll see it a lot. For example, in foods, you see foods are natural. They'll say they're all natural, right? But all natural has no meaning. There's no legal requirement for what's called natural. And there are lots of natural things that'll kill you. You know, snakes, poisonous plants, and so on. But natural sounds appealing, so they put it on lots of foods. The reason I keep insisting that there was a relationship between Iraq and Saddam and Al-Qaeda is because there was a relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, right? And I don't mean to pick on George, but he had a lot of fallacies. So this is what is called a circular argument or begging the question, in which you support your claim by restating your claim. And this is a really obvious example of it. Often it's more subtle because they restate it in a new way, but even if it's restated, if you're just stating what you said to begin with, it's a fallacy. Those are those are examples of all the 4 types of fallacies that I've been talking about. So the ways to deal with them again is, right, to find reasoning fallacies, keep in mind what kinds of reasons are good reasons. So those are ones in which that you use evidence that's related to the issue. And reasoning should be rejected whenever you find mistaken assumptions, distractions, or support for a conclusion that assumes the truth of the conclusion. You don't automatically have to reject reasoning that appeals to authority or group-approved attitudes, right? So like the Coke one. But be cautious about it. Ask yourself whether there are reasons to consider the evidence, or are they only suggesting that because it's popular that it's correct.